Hello and welcome to Runkle of the Bailey. My name is Ian Runkle. I'm a Canadian criminal defense and firearms lawyer. A lot of you have asked me to do a video on batons, so that's what I'm going to do. Now, a baton is a striking implement made of wood, metal, some other material. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Some of them are fixed, so they're basically just a stick that you hit people with, and some of them are expandable, so they contract down into something smaller and extend either with a flick of the wrist or sometimes by means of a spring-loaded button action. Now, these may have different legal principles, and so we'll go through and sort of talk about the principles that apply. I'm also not talking about stun batons or anything else with that kind of electrical feature, because those raise different issues that I'll have to cover in a future video. But as a starting place, let's have a look at the definition of weapon. Weapon means anything used, designed to be used, or intended for use in causing death or injury to any person, or for the purpose of threatening or intimidating any person. This is a useful definition, but when it comes to batons, the courts have typically found without much difficulty that a baton is a weapon, because it's intended, it's designed for hitting people. That's what they're for. So the only situations I've seen where the court has not really been willing to find that it's a weapon are situations where there's been some sort of screw up, and you shouldn't expect that to happen. As an example, there's a case out there where an expandable baton was found in collapsed state, so it was quite small, and none of the officers bothered to actually open the baton, and they didn't bother to expand it and see that it come up to full size. And this didn't happen in court either. So the Crown sort of suggested, apparently after closing their case, well, Judge, you can open it now and see that it can be used as a weapon. And the judge went, nah, I'm not going to do that. It was your job, Crown, to prove that it can be used as a weapon, not my job to step in as an investigator here. So I can't find that it can expand because no evidence was tendered on that fact. And if I can't find that it can expand, I can't find that it's useful as a weapon because that little thing certainly isn't. So that was an acquittal on that basis, but that really comes down to a Crown screw up. Apologies to that Crown, but Crown screw up, at least in my view. So you can't rely on that. You should assume that if you're carrying around a baton, the court is going to determine that it's a weapon, which means that you can't carry it around for self-defense in most circumstances. You certainly can't carry it around for self-defense against sort of ordinary dangers of the world, and you can't carry it concealed. I don't necessarily agree with these laws, but they are the laws, and that's what you're stuck with. But that doesn't tell us all the story, because assuming that it's not illegal to own, you could have one at your house, you could put it up on display. So let's look and see at the prohibited weapons orders if there's anything that would make these banned weapons. So here we've got in former prohibited weapons order number 7, the device commonly known as a Kyoga Baton or steel cobra, and any similar device consisting of a manually triggered telescoping spring-loaded steel whip terminated in a heavy caliber striking tip. It's quite a mouthful. Let's consider what they're talking about here. There's actually a case on this point. It's out of Quebec. It's originally in French. I can read French. I can get through a case in French, but I probably couldn't explain a case in French. So I'm going to be relying on a machine translation here. If there's a bit of sort of janky language, it's probably not the original, it's probably the translation. So this is the case of the Queen in Melbrew. And the circumstances, he's charged with possession of a prohibited weapon, to wit a Kyoga Baton or any other similar instrument. And we see the evidence is police officer Bruno Duquette, during a radar operation, so a speed trap, intercepts a vehicle driven by John Melbrew. When the accused got out of his car, the police officer noticed that he was wearing a telescopic baton similar to a Kyoga Baton on his belt. The police officer seizes the stick, which he considers to be a prohibited weapon. I'm not sure why they got him out of his car for a speeding ticket, but we'll never find out. It's not in the case here. The seized stick is entrusted for expertise to the Laboratory of Forensic Sciences and Forensic Medicine, and the report by physicist Amir Chalchi reveals that it is a telescopic steel stick having a length of 538 millimeters in the open position and 206 millimeters in the closed position. In the closed position, the segments of the stick are retained by friction of a metal bimetallic strip, and the stick is opened by inertia or centrifugal force. We're not really going to care too much about measurements in this case, but they do measure it. To allow comparison, police officer Duquette obtained from the United States a Kyoga Baton, used in the practice of certain martial arts, and produced it as Exhibit P2. According to Mr. Chalchi, the two sticks are similar instruments in that they are two metal sticks consisting of three telescopic segments which open by centrifugal force and having at the end a piece of metal which we use to hit. The two sticks are held in closed position by magnetic force or by friction of a metal bimetallic strip. Now, this is actually fairly wild because the officer actually brought in a Kyoga Baton from the States. And this is going to have a major impact on the case. I'll give you that much as a spoiler. But this never happens. It never happens that they actually go and bring in a comparison example. In this case, it does. And that's amazing. But consider this as a sort of interesting hypothetical here, which is that the officer can do this as part of his exemptions. Peace officers are exempted from certain parts dealing with weapons. But the accused would not be able to go and get a Kyoga Baton to use as evidence here. Because if he went to the States, bought a Kyoga Baton, brought it back, stops at customs, says, yeah, I have this thing, and I'm going to use it in court as evidence on my other charges, the border guards would be saying, that's a great story. Now you have two sets of charges to worry about. And so this is very interesting, and it's a bit of an unusual situation. I'm kind of happy to see it because it really does help the court, as we'll see. So in defense, the accused called Mr. Craig Best, owner of a security agency and security training school, who also acts as an instructor for several police forces in relation to the use of various telescopic or other sticks. According to Mr. Best, the C stick, Exhibit P1, is used in the open position by the security guards to push people back and, if necessary, to strike sideways. Made up of three rigid segments, the grip stick differs from the Kyoga Baton in that the latter, the Kyoga Baton, is formed of a rigid segment into which are inserted the other two segments consisting of a spring which react like a whip when strikes sideways, thus increasing the velocity of the metal mass attached to the end and consequently the impact force of the mass and its dangerousness. In short, according to this expert, the C stick is not a prohibited weapon similar to the Kyoga Baton in that it is not made of springs, giving it the characteristics of a whip. So you see the difference that's being outlined here. The first one, when it extends, forms a solid object. It's one sort of bar. The other, the Kyoga Baton, they're saying is made of springs that make it bendy. And because it's bendy, when you swing it, the springs react and it hits harder than it would have otherwise. So now the question becomes, is this a Kyoga Baton, the thing that the guy was found with? And if not, is it similar enough that it's going to be captured? The other thing that I kind of find myself wondering here, and it's not detailed, but it's just me wondering, is there's this owner of a security agency. I'm wondering if the accused was a security guard, if that explains why he's got this baton, or if he was just carrying it around for no reason. It's not really clear what was going on here. And again, we'll never find out. So the question in dispute, the proof that the object seized was in the possession of the accused is not in dispute because it was worn on his hip, and the latter is not discharged his burden of proving under section 117.11 of the Criminal Code that he was the holder of a permit authorizing it if applicable. And of course, he won't be able to prove that because there is no permit for that. So you can't get a permit to possess a prohibited weapon. There are some people with permits for prohibited firearms, but so he's not ever going to be able to discharge that particular burden. The only question in dispute is whether the object seized in the possession of the accused on October 16th, 2000 is indeed a prohibited weapon within the meaning of the Criminal Code. It's the relevant legislative provisions. And they'll go through the definitions. We've already gone through those here a little bit. And now they're going to compare with the seized object. So on examination, the object seized presents several similarities to the Kyoga Baton. The two sticks are formed by three telescopic metal segments ending in a point with a mass of metal. Both are held in a closed position by friction, and the opening is affected by inertia or centrifugal force. The grip stick has a length of 54 centimeters. I'm going to skip over the measurements because those don't really matter here. They're just fairly similar. Furthermore, while the Kyoga Baton is made up of two flexible springs, which slide and fit into a larger segment of rigid metal, the grip stick is formed of three rigid metal segments, which slide and fit together in the other. When used to strike sideways, the Kyoga Baton reacts like a whip, while the grip stick reacts like a stiff stick. That's an important distinction here. So analysis. To resolve the issue in dispute, it is necessary to interpret the definition of the prohibited weapon set out in Section 13, and they'll go on here. There's a bit about statutory interpretation, but the aspects here, if you have a difficulty which the recourse to ordinary rules of interpretation does not make it possible to satisfactorily overcome, then we are justified in preferring the most favorable interpretation to that which would be liable to be found guilty of an offense. The machine translation didn't do a great job on this. So what this means is that where the law is kind of vague and unclear like this, typically what should happen is that the court interpret this in a fashion that is restrictive, that essentially narrows what the criminal prohibition covers rather than expanding it. Now, the court often doesn't do this, in my personal opinion. This is a criticism I have of the courts generally, but that's sort of how things should go. And the reason for this is that Parliament is the one who drafted the laws. Parliament can fix them if they think that they don't like the result. They can go back and change it, whereas the accused can't. And we don't want to accidentally criminalize innocent behavior. So what the court here is doing is saying we're going to hold them to a restrictive definition rather than an expansive definition where it's unclear which is meant by Parliament. So since the stick seized is not a Kyoga Baton, is it, however, a similar instrument consisting of a telescopic whip with springs triggered manually and terminating in a heavy caliber striking tip? The proof of the comparative examination of exhibits P1 and P2 show that the object seized, like the Kyoga Baton, is a telescopic stick of comparable dimensions, which opens manually by inertia or centrifugal force and ends in a point with a piece of metal of similar size. Furthermore, unlike the Kyoga Baton, which is made up of rigid segments and 2 springs, which give it great flexibility in the open position, the grip stick is formed of 3 rigid segments, without any spring, and remains rigid even in open position. This is the most important difference between these 2 telescopic poles. This difference is important since the impact force of the heavy caliber striking tip, which ends in each of the sticks, will be all the greater as it reaches its objective with a greater velocity resulting from the acceleration produced by the flexible stick made of springs. And they note, moreover, according to the illustrated Petit Larousse, which is a dictionary, a spring is an elastic member capable of withstanding significant deformations and intended to exert a force by tending to resume its initial shape after having been bent, stretched, compressed, or twisted. The etymological and literal interpretation of Article 13 and of the items any similar instrument consisting of, followed by certain specifications, clearly indicates that the legislature considered these to be the essential characteristics that such a similar instrument must have in order to be a prohibited weapon. If this interpretation leaves any doubt as to the legislative intention, recourse to the restrictive interpretation, the most favorable to the accused, makes it possible to settle the question definitively. Although the object seized bears a strong resemblance to the Kyoga Baton, it is not made up, in whole or in part, of springs allowing it to react like a whip. As this is an essential characteristic specified by the legislator in its designation of a prohibited weapon, and which is not found in the object seized, it must therefore be concluded that the telescopic baton in the possession of the accused does not meet the definition of a prohibited weapon within the meaning of Section 91 of the Criminal Code, and therefore the judge acquits. So, that was quite a mouthful. What does all this mean? So what this sort of boils down to is that a fixed baton is, again, certainly a weapon in just about every scenario, but not apparently a prohibited weapon. There's nothing that bans you from having a stick. And that's a good thing, because otherwise we'd be in all sorts of trouble. Think about that. You know, if you've got an axe handle, and is that suddenly a prohibited weapon? Yeah, that would be a very messy scenario. It's very hard for the legislature to ban a stick effectively without sort of being overbroad. But this case was actually further considered in another Quebec decision, and these are all provincial court decisions, so it's very difficult to sort of see here, but they cite the Queen and Melbrew. The Court of Quebec ruled that the term consisting referred to be composed of, so that to qualify as a similar instrument, the weapon must have the following characteristics. So They're saying these are the essential elements that make a particular item a prohibited weapon as a Kyoga Baton or similar implement. 1, telescopic whisk, and this is actually a mistranslation. It's a telescopic whipping action. Fue can mean whip. It can also mean whisk. The translation algorithm picked the wrong one here. 2, provided with a manually activated spring, and 3, finished with a high caliber striking tip. So those are the essential elements, but the whip element is key. Most batons don't act as a whip. They act as a striking implement. They act as a solid stick. So what that tells us is that most batons don't seem to fall into this category. The question that comes up, though, is when you're not talking about a baton that extends with a flick of the wrist or the like, what about the ones that have a spring that extend them? And here I'm talking about the ones that have a spring that extends them, but once they're extended, form sort of a solid bar, a solid stick. And for this, there's dispute over this. A lot of people, in my view, get this wrong. And ultimately, you have to be aware that a court could also, in my view, get this wrong, but they could decide the other way. They could decide that a spring-extended baton is prohibited. But I don't think it is, because the case law specifies that whipping action. And the actual statute specifies that whipping action, that it be a flexible whip. Let's actually have a look. And the reason why people don't sort of get this very easily is that nobody really knows what a Kyoga Baton is. It's a bit of a historical artifact. It's a bit of a curiosity. Let's look a little bit at what the Kyoga Baton or the Steel Cobra actually is. And here is an old advertisement for the Kyoga Baton / Steel Whip. And I'll just read portions of this. When your worst nightmare becomes real and suddenly you are face to face with a mugger, capital letters, you don't need a gun. No self-defense device that you can get without a license can make you feel safer and give you more protection. Strike down any attacker regardless of size or strength with Kyoga, the Steel Cobra. Now, if you're thinking, wait a minute, this looks like something that would be sold out of, the back of a comic book. Only $19.95 plus postage, amazing, no risk, 90-day free trial. It looks like the guy is striking a suspiciously racial caricature. You can see here the language, with capital letters interspersed in various places. Nothing is like it for sure protection against muggers, rapists, and maniacs. This Kyoga, the Steel Cobra, is invisible until you desperately need it. If you're thinking that this sounds kind of like something that was sold out of the back of comic books, it's because it is. That's what we're talking about here. You can see $19.95 free trial coupon, 90-day risk-free trial. Somebody looked through the back of a comic book and decided that this terrifying weapon that is a thunderbolt of life-saving power at your command needed to be banned, when really what we're talking about here is a novelty item. This is an unusual sort of novelty item. I don't understand why this thing was banned, but when we actually look at this picture, you can see they've got an image of what the Kyoga Baton looks like. So right here, and you can see that it's exactly as it was described in the case law. There's one rigid segment here where his hand is holding it, and then there's 2 spring sections. So this is a bendy object. It's flexible. If you swing it, it's going to bend and then swing back. And if you're wondering, wait a minute, why is this being sold, out of the back of comic books? Why is it this sort of weird language to it? Well, the inventor of this particular item is known for a few other major inventions. He's also known for inventing sea monkeys and X-ray specs. This is a novelty along the lines of sea monkeys and X-ray specs. And yet, somehow, our legislature decided that this thing needed to be banned, that this is a highly dangerous weapon, and somehow a priority for Canadian society. So, I don't get it. But when we actually look at this item, we can see now what they were intending to ban. So a lot of people read this section, and they see the word spring there, and they assume that this means that a spring-loaded baton must have been what they're trying to capture, where it's a baton that extends and then becomes sort of a solid stick. In my view, that doesn't appear to be what Parliament was trying to capture. They're trying to capture this magical mystery device that is probably a piece of garbage. So, but ultimately, the court may not decide the same way. Frankly, if Melbrew, if they hadn't brought in the actual Kyoga Baton for the judge to look at, the judge may well have fixated on the description of it as having had springs and decided that a spring baton itself is a prohibited weapon. Again, I think that's the wrong definition, but if you're considering, hey, I want to go and buy a spring baton, like one of these batons that becomes a stick when it's extended, you got to be aware that there's some risk that you could get arrested and a judge could go out the other way. I think, again, that would be the wrong decision, but I can't say, hey, go buy one right now. You're going to be perfectly fine, because that may not actually be the case. But this is my view of the correct interpretation of the law, and I think it's well supported when we actually look at what we're dealing with here. We can see the picture of what this thing is. In my view, it's fairly clear that what they're talking about is different than just a simple baton. Thank you for watching. I hope you found this to be interesting or educational. Please like, share, and subscribe. I really do appreciate it. I also will link to the cases I mentioned below, as well as to my Patreon. I want to thank my $10 Patreon supporters, Ma Buddy Keith, Process Eng, Stephen Larson, Mark D, General Counsel of the CCFR, John Robinson, Tim Rogers, Roy Haddock, Fracklestack, Jean-Alexandre Tessier, Cameron Johnson, Sir Goat, Sights and Arms Limited, Chaba Hollow, Peter Hynam, Craig Kwan, Akin Coxall, North Central Process Service, Toys Are for Boys, Ian Vaughn, Milan Vrekic, Terrence Griffiths, Doug Thompson, Brad Crooker, Jason Harrington, Lee Kiso, Mark Stout, Scott Sweetman, Mike Rhodes, Alvaro Bataille, DF, Stacy Cartmel, Tactical Advantage TV Canada, Ian S., Dave Leslie, and a special thank you to $30 supporter Steve Browning and to $50 supporter George. If you've watched all this through, you've got a level of knowledge that may exceed that of many police officers, at least on this particular issue. As I've said, this is actually a sort of dangerous level of knowledge to have, because it may lead you to do something that, in my view, and possibly in your view, is lawful, that may not be seen as lawful by the police officer. I recommend against buying any baton with a spring extend function simply for that reason. But I can't, you make your choices. Certainly don't buy a Kyoga Baton for two reasons. One, prohibited weapon in Canada. Two, garbage. Don't buy them for the same reason you don't buy X-ray specs. I wonder if the person who added this to the ban list went on to buy X-ray specs and then was seriously disappointed when they were walking around Parliament going, man, I got ripped off, but it's a good thing we banned those Kyoga Batons, because I'm sure those worked so much better. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I hope this has armed you with knowledge.